I was driving down the two-laned road called London Groveport Road when I saw a white shape, what I thought was a woman, floating across the road. The shape moved into the woods and I slammed on my brakes. The car skidded to a quick halt. For a second, I just sat there, stunned, silent. Eventually, I looked down the path and I saw the woman. She was floating away from me down this long trail, and then she just disappeared into thin air. I was stunned, but eventually shook myself back into reality. This was just the beginning of my very frightening tale. Just near the community of Darbydale, which is barely a blip on the map, is a cemetery off a two-lane road. Its official name is Little Pennsylvania Cemetery, but locally it is known as Woolyburger Cemetery. Nobody seems to really know how it got that name. It's a fairly small cemetery on a hillside with a smattering of a couple hundred tombstones. I got out of my car and cautiously made my way down the path, eventually reaching the cemetery. I scanned it for any signs of the ghost woman, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. I'm not sure what drove me, but I decided to make my way deeper into the cemetery for any more signs of the supernatural. For several minutes I searched, but there was no signs of any life or any of the undead. I made my way back down the hill and was about ready to leave the cemetery when I heard a blood-curdling scream, which I believe came from the ghostly woman. Then I heard a man in a total rage bellowing, and I assumed it was at her. And I looked back toward the entrance of the cemetery, and I saw a dark shape there, holding some kind of weapon. I'm not sure what it was. It could have been a knife or an axe. But I could feel waves of energy pouring off this dark shape. It was full of rage and anger. It was very frightening, to say the least. I scanned the area, looking for a way out, but that would mean I'd have to traverse through the woods. I wasn't sure what to do until the dark shape started shambling my way, and this made my decision for me. I ran into the woods, tromping through a local stream and getting myself entirely muddy as I tried to make my way back to the road and to my car. I could hear the man screaming in a full-on psychotic rage. Then I heard the woman scream again, but this was cut off by a chopping sound. This froze me to my core as I looked up the hill at the cemetery. Eventually I was able to make it up the hillside and back to the road. I looked back at the cemetery and I could hear the man screaming again. The voice echoed through the woods. I jumped into my car and I got out of there as fast as I could. Later, I would do a little research and I'd learned about the history of William or Willie Butcher, who had built a house across the road from the cemetery. He was a very well-respected man in the area, but for some unknown reason, he went insane and he killed his wife and children with a butcher knife. And then he eventually killed himself. It was a truly tragic tale. People say now his soul still patrols that cemetery looking for more victims. As a kid, I liked to hike in the woods in the area around my community, which was called Darbydale. It was really a tiny place, which really wasn't even a town or a village. I hadn't lived there very long, so I didn't know much about the area, but I liked hiking, so I would explore the area. So I was hiking down this trail, and I saw some stones ahead, and I heard some strange chanting. It was rhythmic, and it echoed throughout the forest. It seemed to entrance me and draw me towards the stones I saw. And as I got closer, I could see that they were really gravestones, part of a cemetery. As stealthily as I could, I made my way toward the cemetery, and I started moving along the tombstones, trying to figure out where the source of the chanting was. The chanting seemed to be in a foreign language, or maybe some long dead language. I really wasn't sure. I was just a little kid at the time. Eventually I moved past some trees, and I saw several people in dark robes standing together around some form on the ground, which I really couldn't make out. They were chanting, sometimes looking at the form on the ground and sometimes looking up at the sky for some unknown reason. I could see they held something in their hands, but I wasn't sure. But then I got a closer look, and I could see a large knife. And this sent a chill down my spine, and the hairs on the back of my neck went up at full attention. I didn't know what they were doing, but I knew it was something I really didn't want to see, and that I should get the hell out of there as fast as possible. I started slowly backing up, not paying attention to where I was going, when I tripped on one of the grave markers, and I tumbled to the ground with a small yelp as I landed. I wasn't hurt, but I had the wind knocked out of me for a moment. I looked back at the shapes, and they all slowly looked my way, and I knew I was in big trouble. One of them yelled, "We have to get the interloper!" This was my cue to get the hell out of there. I scrambled to my feet and ran blindly into the woods. I could hear footsteps and yells behind me. They were saying things like, "We gotta get him, or we can't let him get away." I kept winding in and out of the trees, avoiding them, and eventually I found a hollow tree and hid inside. And they moved past me, and for a moment I thought I was doomed. But eventually they moved away. I was afraid to make a sound, and I knew I couldn't stay there forever. But after a few minutes of no sounds around me, I crawled out of the tree and made my way home. I asked one of my neighbors about the cemetery, and they said it was called Woolyburger Cemetery. It was a really strange place, and kids should never go there. People had rumors about all kinds of ghosts or monsters, or even a cult that used to use the place for human sacrifices. Now, I don't know what that all added up to. Some people said it might have been a meeting place for the Klan, but nobody could ever prove that. I just knew one thing. I was never going to go back near that place and hear the sounds of that chanting again. Lost believing Tarl Hill must run a stern high road. Everybody in my area seemed to know about Woolyburger Cemetery and the strange things that happened there. Kids were drawn there like moths to a flame to find out if there was any truth in those rumors. Some would come back and say there was nothing there. Others had incredible stories of strange happenings. As I was a fan of things like that, and I always had to prove that I wasn't afraid of anything, I knew I had to go there. I made the trip down from Columbus, which is only about 20 minutes away, and I found the path that leads to the cemetery. It was neatly mowed and led back about 150 yards to the small cemetery. I made my way down the path, keeping out a keen eye for anything unnatural or maybe even natural. The place was quiet that day, and I didn't see anything or anybody as I made my way closer to the tombstones. Despite my brave outside appearance, I felt a little fear creeping into my stomach because of all the stories I'd heard. Eventually I got to the cemetery and I looked around, and it didn't seem all that terrifying. I moved among the tombstones, checking some of them out. Some were very old and some had been vandalized, which was pretty sad. And a few were more recent than I would imagine for this place. I got to the back of the cemetery, which is at the top of the hill, and I scanned the area again. I heard nothing until there was some strange rustling noise off in the woods, not too far away from me. It sounded like something very large moving through the underbrush. At first I thought it might be a deer or some kind of animal. I was really having trouble pinpointing the source of the sound, but I finally saw some movement in the trees, and I couldn't believe what I saw. It was a large furry shape, man-sized, but even taller. It slowly moved through the forest, and then somehow it must have sensed me. Maybe it had an animal sense of smell, but it just stopped dead in its position, and it turned towards me. It stared directly at my location. I could feel the intensity of its focus on me, as if it was evaluating what I was and if I was a danger to it. I took a couple tentative steps backward, and then it let out a huge roar that filled the forest. Fear blossomed inside my chest, and I just spun and ran down the hill, past the tombstones, and then back down the path to my car. As I ran, I could hear the roars of whatever this beast was. Later, I would joke that I now knew how the place got its name Woolyburger. It was from the woolly figure that prowled the woods around the area. To this day, I can still hear the roar of that creature echoing throughout the woods as I remember my trip there.